So this is the second walk in the series following their footsteps of Jewish homes in St. John. And today we're going to take a walk down King Street East. So this is something you may not have known, is that King Street East was originally named Great George Street in honor of King George III, who was the King of England at the time that the city streets were laid out in 1783. If you're facing towards the water with King Square at your back, all of the buildings on the right-hand side of the street would have been destroyed by the Great St. John Fire in 1877. Many of the buildings on the other side, I guess, survived. And because these buildings are within a heritage district, I do have a few notes on the architecture of some of these buildings. So I just figure out how to move my slides. So we did receive a grant to create this walking tour program from the St. John Community Arts Board a couple of years ago. And so today we're going to drop in and visit the Pikowski family, the Cantor family, the Featherman family, the Margolian family, the Holtzmans, the Levines, and the Bassons. And the Bassons are a recent addition, so if I trip over a few words, you'll have to forgive me. So we'll start down the street, and we'll start at 113 King Street East, which was the home of the Pikowski family. And I skipped the page, so I'll have to remember to go back. Okay, so this building in recent years had been owned by the Irving family in St. John, who have the oil company and the wood and everything else. And this building was demolished about a month ago. However, because this is one of our families and I have a nice enough picture of the house, it's staying on the walk regardless. So perhaps by the next time everyone visits St. John, there is supposed to be a lovely little park there. So the house itself dates from 1941, and it was built specifically for the Pikowski family and was one of only a few buildings that were constructed during the early years of the Second World War. For the architectural buffs in the group, this is a colonial revival style house. And this house was built on the site of the former St. John Presbyterian Church that dated from 1840 and which had survived the fire. So, who were the Pikowskis? So we'll start with Jacob Pikowski, who lived from 1888 to 1960. He was born in Poland, and he came to St. John in 1918 after growing up in the United States. He married Harriet Gilbert of St. John in 1912, and for the first 6 years of their marriage, they did live in Waterville, Maine. Harriet Pikowski, whose dates are 1889 to 1963, was born in Montreal. Her parents were Harris and Gertrude Gilbert, and she had 3 brothers and 2 sisters. And they, in turn, Jacob and Harriet had 2 children, Morton Pikowski and Ronna Pikowski Hoffman. And when the family returned to St. John in 1918, Jacob Pikowski became the owner and manager of Duvall's hardware store on Waterloo Street. So Morton Pikowski, 1918 to 1967, managed the store after the death of his father. And Morton Pikowski himself died at only the age of 48. He had married Bessie Frances Rabkin on September 14th, 1941, and they in turn had 2 children, Sandra and Jason, who we'll get to in due course. And Morton Pikowski himself enlisted in the Royal Canadian Air Force and served from 1943 to 1944. And he was on the grounds crew as an aircraftsman second class, and he was posted to Montreal and Victoriaville, Quebec, and then to Mount Hope, Ontario. And when he completed his service, he returned to St. John and to the hardware store. There are a few interesting things I've turned up about the hardware store. Duval's was incorporated as a company in 1933 and had a capital stock of $10,000. And it was divided into 100 shares of $100 each. And I've posted different things about the store over the years, and I got some comments from Facebook posts that we had. And one of those comments actually comes from Jason Pikowski, who wrote to me, "Many memories of our store, a coal-burning furnace to heat the building, a catwalk ramp raised and lowered across the back alley to connect the store to the warehouse, open early on weekday mornings for the tradespeople on their way to a job site. We cut and sold glass and putty and points to the glaziers. So many items weighed and sold in bulk, nails, screws, nuts, and bolts. The toy department was a wonder for any kid, and we sold chemistry sets and model steam engines. And we sold school supplies just before and during the first days of back to school, campfire notebooks and Hilroy scribblers, geometry sets and Quink ink for refillable pens." And what child wouldn't have been excited by this description of Duval's hardware store that came from Norman, Hamburg? I have fond memories of Mort Pikowski's store with its extensive stock of hardware and the toy department on the second level upstairs. There was a fabulous toy selection and an electric train display that was all set up and really fabulous. A whole setup with the trains rolling through the countryside, bridges, train whistles, etc., that could keep a young person's attention for a long time. Those were the days. And Kathy Cohen remembered, "When I was a very little girl, my grandmother," and her grandmother was Bessie Cohen, "would take me to Duval's to help me buy my gifts for Hanukkah. I had $20 to spend and always bought what I needed and had change left over." Can you imagine having change left over today? Sandra Pikowski, the daughter of the family. I'll show you a couple of ads from Duval's first. So the school books that we talked about, and then the Christmas values. So hockey skates and boots from $3.29 to $4.75. Mountie suits, I thought this was interesting, $4.25. If you wanted to have a cowboy suit, it was only $1.89. Trying to see, pencils was a penny each, or 10 cents for a dozen. Book bags, 39 cents, 49 cents, somewhere between 1 and 5 cents for a ruler. Those must have been the days. So Sandra Pikowski moved to Montreal, and she was professor of art history at Concordia University for 40 years. And while she was there, she founded the first Canadian art history program, was the curator and director of the Concordia Art Gallery from 1981 to 1992, and was the co-founder, managing editor, and contributor to the Journal of Canadian Art History for more than 30 years. And she was named as a member of the Order of Canada in November of 2015. And she did make some visits back to St. John, so she has given lectures at the New Brunswick Museum back in the day on, for example, 17th century French painting and illustrated lecture. So I thought that was kind of neat. Jason Pikowski studied at UNB St. John and at York University, and I believe had a career in the film and television industry. And he was one of the first students at the new University of New Brunswick St. John campus in Milledgeville. And in September of 1968, he was chair for the Frosh Week on that newly opened campus. And in a newspaper story that I found, he noted that the biggest change in the week was a greater emphasis on learning more about the campus and the courses rather than on the hazing of the students. The biggest event was to be an obstacle course on the Tucker Park campus. He also was invited to co-author a report on the future of that campus, and included recommendations to cut ties with UNB Fredericton to become independent. That has not happened, 40 and 50 some years on. Recommendation to establish programs in fine arts, business, and medicine. Well, we've got the business, we've got the medicine. It also urged the campus to keep its uptown locations, There is an uptown building that came back into play a few years ago. And he wrote, and the report noted this as well: a university, when it becomes an integral part of the community, is closely allied with the intellectual, social, and cultural development of the city. And then he went on to careers with Pollution Probe, and then, as I said, into TV and film. And when I was researching the Paikowski family, I also came across this really interesting story, which I'm going to read. And this was for sure a vacation to remember. So this is from the Evening Times Globe, which many of you read when you were living here. And it's dated October 15, 1937. And the headline relates killing of 2 bandits. St. John man on scene soon after Bangor slaying. Jacob Paikowski, proprietor of Duval's hardware store, Waterloo Street, returning with his wife and family by automobile from a Thanksgiving Day holiday spent with relatives at Waterville, was just 15 minutes late to witness the G-Men cleanup of the Al Brady gang on a Bangor street early Tuesday morning. But he saw enough to convince him that the United States federal government operatives on the trail of dangerous criminals are a fearless, calm, and thorough brand of men. On Central Street, in front of Dakin's hardware store, where the fatal drama occurred, all was confusion when the St. John man stopped his car after hearing street shouts of a gang killing. The 35-year-old Indiana bandit robber killer, Al Brady, lay stretched out in the middle of the road, riddled with G-men bullets, while his 21-year-old lieutenant, Clarence Shafford Jr., lay a few yards away, also dead. Quote, it seemed like about 5,000 people were gathered around when we arrived, said Mr. Paikowski. Machine gun pellets were scattered all over the street. One of the cars parked on the side of the road had its tires almost shot to ribbons. The gangster's car front window was splintered with shots. The Brady car was a brand new, polished 7-passenger machine. We stayed in Bangor about half an hour, and everyone was running around excitedly. I was particularly impressed with the way the G-men handled the situation. They appeared quite unconcerned after the shooting and calmly went about stowing the machine guns back in the cases, which looked like violin cases, said Mr. Paikowski. And R.C. Vaughn, proprietor of Vaughn Sheet Metal and Roofing Company, Union and Carmarthen Street, had passed through Bangor the day before the shooting. Quote, no, I wasn't there and wasn't anxious to be anywhere around the shooting going on either, he smilingly informed a reporter of the Evening Times Globe. So you can imagine coming back from a vacation with that story. So we moved next door to 119 King Street East. When I started writing this walk, I was convinced that building was still there. So when I went just to walk down the street, I realized it was gone, but I wasn't going to throw out the work I had done. And so this was the home of the Cantor family, Samuel and Pearl Cantor, and their 4 children, Bernard, Yale, Doreen, and Myrna. And I have a little thing from Myrna Cantor Taylor that I was going to open with, but I missed my page. And this was something she wrote for an exhibit we did a few years ago. And she wrote, when we lived on King Street East, the Paikowski family lived a few doors away, well, really right next door. Across the street in winter was the postage stamp skating rink, then the fire hall with sirens day and night. On Halloween, they always held a costume competition and they gave out treats. One year, Yale and I won dressed as a tramp and clown. Doreen chaperoned. All of the winners were taken by bus to the Capitol Theater and paraded across the stage for the audience. My dad partnered with Jack Cohen Glamour Garment Company, sewing suits and coats on Charlotte Street. My dad and his load of wonderfully made suits and coats traveling the Maritimes. I went to Dufferin Street School and vocational school. One of my teachers forever admired many outfits my dad made for me and always asking if he would make her the same. Manchester Robertson Allison, a large department store on King Street where my father worked. Across the street, Jaime Koshetsky had a wonderful antique store. Having taken so much time to churn up days, happy memories, and memories past, always makes me feel my home is still St. John. The memories still keep flowing. opening happy memories and things past. Memories never fade, they just get tucked away. So the Cantors, So they had lived originally at 629 Main Street in the city's North End with their 4 children. So Samuel Cantor, worked as a tailor for Maritime Cloak, which was owned by the Aronoff family. And he also worked for the American Ladies Tailoring operation, which was owned by Abraham Rozovsky on Princess Street. And there were many local residents who remembered owning or wearing coats made by him, including the Isaac sisters. So if you were on the walk last week, you saw them wearing their coats from Samuel Cantor. And Pearl Cantor was the daughter of Samuel and Leah Kashetsky, and had a brother Israel and 3 sisters, Kay, Jen, and Faye. And they had 4 children. And these coats that you see on the screen were probably made by their father. So I'm going to start with the sons first. So Dr. Bernard Cantor graduated from St. John High School, UNB, and from Dalhousie. He was the first Jewish doctor in Moncton, New Brunswick, and he was also the coroner for Westmoreland County in that corner of the province. He later specialized in child psychiatry and was the clinical director of child and adolescent psychiatry at Haverford State Hospital in Pennsylvania, and was a lecturer at Bryn Mawr College. Dr. Yale Cantor also did St. John High School in Dalhousie, and then went on to the University of Minnesota, where he specialized as an ophthalmologist. He had a private practice in St. Paul, Minnesota from 1967 to 2003. He taught at the University of Minnesota Medical School, and he published many papers. He also led volunteer medical trips to places like India, Russia, and Israel. And he was the recipient of the Helen Keller Site Award in 2005. This picture shows the family out in Pamdenack. So I'll talk now about the 2 daughters. So Doreen Cantor trained as a nurse in St. Stephen, New Brunswick, and she moved to Montreal when she married Barney Collins in November of 1960. And Myrna trained as a stenographer, and she moved to Toronto when she married Tony Taylor in October 1958. I know that Myrna has since passed away. She died in 2017. Both of the brothers have died. I'm not sure about Doreen, but perhaps at the end of the walk, somebody can let me know and I can update that. Our next stop is at 175 King Street East. And this is an older building. It was built before 1880. And the 3rd floor that you can see at the top is added in 1910. One of the families that lived in this building, non-Jewish families, was James Scoville, who owned Scoville Brothers, which was the men's clothing store on King Street. So there are some Georgian dormers and some nice floral designs. And our interest is that the Featherman family lived here from 1956 until the 1960s. So Albert and Rose Featherman and their 2 children, Sydney and Sarah. And this picture of Albert Featherman that you see on the screen is probably one of my favorite pictures because it shows somebody doing something that they obviously did very well. The Featherman story is a little bit different than many of the others that I have, because Albert Featherman is a survivor of the Holocaust. He survived the Lodge Ghetto and the camps at Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. Let's see. So his family was sent to the Lodge Ghetto in 1942, where he was a slave laborer and a tailor. And he went into the Lodge Ghetto with a wife and 2 children who did not survive. After the Lodge Ghetto was liquidated in 1944, he went on to Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, and he was working as a slave laborer for Continental Rubber. After the war, he went into the displaced persons camp in Germany, in Hohn, Germany, near Bergen-Belsen. And it was here that he began to rebuild his life. He was introduced to Rosalia Wiesel, And if the Weasel name sounds familiar, it's the same Weasel family that was in St. John. And Rose herself had come from Hungary. And of course, under normal circumstances, they would never have met. But like many of the families in the displaced persons camp or many of the people, they began rebuilding their lives. And their first child, Sydney, was born in the camp in 1948. Herman and Joseph Weasel in St. John, with the shoe store, provided assistance and sponsorship to the family to bring them to Canada. And the Feathermans arrived in Halifax at Pier 21 on October the 1st, 1948. They lived first on Chipman Hill before moving onto King Street East, first at 244 and then to 175. And after they arrived in St. John, they had their second child, Sarah. The Feathermans became Canadian citizens in 1957. There was a nice little notice in the newspaper. Albert Featherman was a tailor and furrier for Abraham Rozovsky on Princess Street, so at American Ladies Tailoring, and later a tailor for Jack Kalp's men's shop on King Street. Sadly, Rose Featherman died young at the age of 48 in 1963, and Albert Featherman moved to Toronto in 1976 and lived to be 91 before he died. And I've talked a bit about Rose Featherman. This is a photograph that was taken while they were still in the displaced persons camp. So here's Sydney Featherman, probably shortly before they were left for Canada. So Sarah and Sydney Featherman both attended Prince Charles School and St. John High School. Sydney graduated from high school in 1965. Was involved with the yearbook and the dramatic club, went on to study at McGill University in Montreal and Duke University in North Carolina, and studied organic chemistry, and now lives in Ottawa. He's on the call here today. Sarah is a gifted musical performer, so she started her musical career in the school system, performing in the musicals in elementary and in high school, and I believe now makes her home in Europe. So a little farther down the street, we come to 214 and 216 King Street East, where we find the Margolian and the Holtzman families. So this was a double house. And this house is a Queen Anne style house. There are 13 steps leading up from the street to the front door. The first owner of this building was John McDonald, who was an inspector at the Customs House. So we'll talk first about the Margolian family, who moved into this building during the Second World War and lived here until the 1980s. So Jacob Margolian was born in Minsk, Russia, and grew up in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, and began working as a shoe salesman at the age of 15. He opened Margolian Shoes in St. John in 1921, first at 107 Charlotte Street, then he moved next door to 105 Charlotte Street, and then finally to 1 Charlotte Street at the corner with Union Street in 1948. In 1953, he expanded the store into an adjacent building, and it became one of the largest shoe retail stores in Eastern Canada. So there were 2 levels at 1 Charlotte Street that included offices and storage on the upper floors. And when he expanded in 1953, he also added women's handbags and hosiery. They improved the shelving, and his customers came from St. John, Lancaster, across the harbor, from visitors to the city, and he also did mail orders from across the Maritime provinces. In November 1962, the newspaper announced that Jacob Margolian had joined the staff of Kalp's as their general manager and shoe buyer, and he was also managing the bargain basement. And the reporter described him as an expert shoe fitter and stylist of men's, women's, and children's shoes. He said he will be happy to meet his many customers and friends at Kalp's. And his move to Kalp's was part of their expansion in 1963. And he stayed at the store for about 5 years, retiring in 1967. So a couple of ads for Margolian shoes. So I think the shoes you're seeing on the screen have probably been in and out of style a few times over the years. But I like the idea that you could buy a pair of shoes for $5. Sylvia Margolian, I don't have a picture of her, but she also came from Minsk in Russia, and she was the daughter of Frank and Rose Kitaev. And Sylvia and Jacob Margolian had two sons, Samuel and Leonard. So I'll start with Leonard Margolian, who was the older of the two. And he moved to Riverview, New Brunswick, so just outside of Moncton, where he also owned a Margolian's quality shoe store. So he married and had 4 children, Lois Ann, Sandra, Franklin, and Joel. And Samuel Margolian, who was born and lived in St. John from 1933 to 1982. He became a teacher at St. John High School, and he taught math and history. He also had an interest in Carl Jung and was studying Jungian psychology in Zurich, Switzerland. And he was there from, I think, about 1969 to 1971, pursuing those studies. And his wife, Lorna, was an art assistant at the New Brunswick Museum. And not quite sure how these came to, but Ansel Koshetsky shared some of his memories of Samuel Margolian. And he wrote, "I knew Sam well. He taught me algebra and history at St. John High School. He was an inspiring teacher who made both subjects interesting. Later, we became very good friends and shared common interests. Sam was a cultured man with a lively intellectual curiosity. He had a keen interest in Jungian psychology and spent several years pursuing that interest at the Jungian Institute in Zurich, Switzerland. His apartment on Pitt Street contained a large library of books and an eclectic record collection that included popular artists, classical recordings, and operas. Sam frequently invited his friends to his apartment, where he played selections from his collection, introducing them to artists and music for the first time. He was witty and gregarious and loved to meet friends at the Riviera restaurant, where over coffee there would be lively discussions on art, politics, and philosophy." So the other half of the house, the 216 half of the building, was the home of the Holtzman family. And this would have included Harry, Anne, Norman, and Myra. So Harry Holtzman was born in St. John at 182 Prince Edward Street, where the Holtzman family was living at the time, Nathan and Bessie Holtzman, who had come from Poland. He had 3 brothers, Jack, Abram, and Morris, and 3 sisters, Ethel, Jean, and Ada. He married Anne Friedman in 1939, and she was a daughter of Abraham and Mary Friedman, and grew up on Summer Street, the street we'll visit later on in the series. And then the Holtzmans moved to King Street East in the 1950s. So in 1936, the newspaper carried a feature on the businesses of Waterloo Street, and this included the Sunray Fruit Store, which was one of the stores that Harry Holtzman owned. And this started on a very small scale, beginning in 1933 with Harry and Mo Holtzman carrying a complete stock of fresh fruit, vegetables, candy, cigarettes, and tobacco. And they catered to the hospital trade. And the story notes, to mark their 3rd anniversary in business, they had recently renovated the premises and enlarged their fruit display in order to accommodate their growing business. And they've taken in a full stock of groceries and canned goods. So they remained in partnership until 1954, and Mo continued on with the Sunray Fruit Store. And Harry moved on to open the first retail television store in the Maritime Provinces, in an 1,800 square foot store. And this store offered both sales and service to his customers. And he was also the first to offer TV rentals to shut-ins, hospital patients, and vacationers. And then beginning in 1955, and for the next 25 years, the store began to expand slowly and became one of the largest furniture stores in St. John, and offered major brand names and service to new generations of customers. They also sold appliances. So the store that most of you remember on Waterloo Street took up three floors, 12,000 square feet of space, plus a separate warehouse. Norman Holtzman joined the business when he graduated from Dalhousie University in 1965 with a commerce degree, and was the manager and vice president of the store, and then took over the store when his father retired after 50 years in the business. And Norman Holtzman had also opened a second store in the Kmart Lancaster Mall on the west side of the city. So when Harry Holtzman wasn't busy selling fruit and then furniture and televisions, he was well known as a baseball player and a basketball player for the YMHA, and was an active board member of the synagogue. And the picture here is when he revisited his bar mitzvah on the anniversary, I think it was 50 or 60 years after his original bar mitzvah performance. So both ads from the two different stores. 5 pounds of beans for 25 cents, less than $200 for a refrigerator. Ann Holtzman, like I said, was the daughter of Abraham and Mary Friedman. She belonged to the Hadassah and Sisterhood. She helped out at the office in the store, and if there were problems, I guess she was the one who solved them, and also helped bring up the two children, Norman and Myra. So as I said, Norman followed his father into business at Holtzman's, and he closed the store in the 1990s. Did spend some time selling furniture with businesses called Simply Furniture and then River Valley Furniture. Retired for good in 2003. And he's seen here in this picture with his wife, Janet Newman, and their two sons, Wayne and Jeffrey. And then, of course, we have Myra Friedman, who, when she was young, was involved with the Brownies and with Young Judea before heading off to Dalhousie University. And she began her teaching career in 1971 and spent her teaching career in elementary schools. She married Larry Freeman, and they had 3 children. She was involved quite widely in the community as a volunteer with educational and theater organizations, including the Nova Scotia Talent Trust Fund, the Atlantic Theater Festival Foundation, Grace Maternity Hospital, Jewish organizations. And then she was involved in some really big events, like bringing the World Figure Skating Championships and the G7 Summits to Halifax. And she was named, most famously, the Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia, and held that role from 2000 to 2006. She was the first woman in Nova Scotia named as a Lieutenant Governor, and she was the first Jewish person in Canada named as a Lieutenant Governor. During her time in that position, she opened the Vice-Regal Home for many events and reached out to young people to teach them about the heritage of the province and promote the arts and seek out ordinary citizens and recognize them for their accomplishments. So our next stop is 246 King Street East. And this was a house that was built in the 1920s. It's kind of hard to tell because of the tree that blocks part of the building, but it's built in the Italianate style. So there are a pair of bay windows. And in fact, when I was giving the walk this summer, I was standing out front explaining the history of the house to a few people, and the current owner of the house turned up. And they've done a lot to bring the house back into good condition and to really bring it back to life for their own family. So 246 King Street East was the home of the Levine family. So Jack and Anne Levine and their children, Ellis and Sandra. So Jack Levine was born in Dorbion, Lithuania. His parents were Abraham and Sarah Levine, and his 2 brothers were Percy and Benjamin, and his 2 sisters were Ida and Fanny. He graduated from St. John High School in 1924 and then went on to Dalhousie University. Much of his married life was spent on King Street East in the house I've just showed you, and his wife was Ann Meltzer. They got married on July the 7th, 1935, but it almost didn't happen. Anne had told Jack that she wouldn't marry him unless he had his own business, and she went off to New York without him. Jack sent her a telegram in January 1935, letting her know she could now come home because he had bought a business. And they worked together in that business for many years that followed. And the business he was the owner and manager of, Jack's Men's Shop at 200 Union Street, which operated from 1935 until 1982. And his son followed him into the business after he finished high school in 1958. So Jack's Men's Shop carried a number of well-known brands of work clothing. And in the 1940s, the store expanded to include sportswear and casual clothing. In 1948, they added suits and overcoats. The store was damaged by fire in 1948, but within a year, the store was repaired and open again. And this time they added men's hats. And then in 1970, and this was an idea from Ellis Levine, the store added a section called the Mezzanine. And this was a fashion boutique that sold jeans and corduroy pants. And the store also had a bargain basement. The store frontage was 67 feet and was numbered from 200 to 204 Union Street. So he had expanded from that original 1935 purchase. The newspaper quoted Jack Levine in 1935. "Now we are a complete men's shop. The man on the job, the man in the office, the student, the man at the wedding, the groom. There is not one man in St. John we can't outfit." After the store closed in 1982, I know it's been a number of things, but most recently it was a hairstyling school, and it's now a Chinese grocery store. And if you walk by the door and you happen to be looking down, you'll notice that the word Jack's is still spelled out in the tiles at the entrance to the store. So when Jack Levine wasn't busy in the store, he was busy in the Jewish community, with the Boy Scouts, with Habonim, with B'nai B'rith. He was also president of the YMHA and was involved with the Jewish Servicemen's Center during the Second World War. And the YMHA had their rooms above Jack's Men's Shop, and this included space for a chess club and chess tournaments. Outside of the Jewish community, he was involved with the St. John Merchants Association, including a term as vice president. And at the time he was vice president, Abe Kalp was the president. He was also the assistant secretary of the Royal Canada Cases Yacht Club in 1947. And he was an active member of the Men of Fundy Barbershop Chorus, and he was their president in 1970. Many people would also know him as an avid sportsman and sports promoter. So he did have a basketball team, Jack's Athletics. And he also provided trophies for the most valuable player for the CPR Softball League in 1949. Anne Levine was the daughter of Samuel and Alice Meltzer. She had three sisters, Lillian, Kay, and Frances, and three brothers, Edward, William, and Gar, and then a stepbrother, Murray, and a stepsister, Mary. She started her working days at the age of 16 in Margolian Shoe Store. So all of these families linked together. And Jack was working at Margolian's at the same time, and he was her boss. But clearly love prevailed. So she did work alongside her husband in Jack's Men's Shop. She waited on the customers, helped the seamstresses. And then in 1960, she opened her own business across the street when she purchased the Spear Millinery Building. It had been the largest millinery store in Canada. And Anne traveled to New York to purchase stock from the renowned Mr. John, whose hats were the very last word in women's fashion at the time. She had found a niche in St. John, which led to great success. She loved working in the store and had such an eye for style that at one point in her life, she was making regular trips to Boston to direct fashion shows. So a picture of the store, and the Jack's is still written on the sidewalk, and an advertisement for the grand opening of the bargain basement Ellis Levine, as I said, worked alongside his father at the shop. And then after the store closed, went into commercial real estate sales. Married Terry, and they have 3 children, Sarah Lynn, Micah, and Daniel. And a few years ago, they did move from St. John to Ottawa to be closer to their children. And then Sandra Levine was an avid figure skater through her teens with the St. John Figure Skating Club. And her father had organized many of these skating shows. She also trained in Montreal with Otto Gold, an Olympic coach who had trained Barbara Ann Scott. And she had, when she completed her education, she had a master's in social work from Carleton University. And she also lives in Ottawa. So I have some written memories from Ellis Levine, who remembers that it was a, quote, a pretty good neighborhood. I skated at the postage stamp at the fire station on King Street East and played street hockey at the bottom of King Street East. It was also a short walk to my father's store at 200 Union Street. The Jewish community was very large in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. The Shoal was the hub. Wolf Cubs and Boy Scouts were busy. There was no television until 1954, so we entertained ourselves. We often walked to Lily Lake to go skating, carrying a hockey stick, plowed our own rink, changed on a snowbank. Boots were goalposts, no boards, often lost a puck in a snowbank. Our mothers were very active in the Shoal, and the dinners there were wonderful and very well attended. They cooked a father and son Boy Scout dinner every year. Cater was very strict, and junior congregation was mandatory. Most of us spent some time in Pamdenack, and many went to Camp Kadima. My father had season tickets for the St. John Beavers hockey team, and occasionally I was allowed to go, but only to a Saturday night game, never during school nights. In 1948, the Canadian men's senior basketball tournament was played at the St. John Armory, and my father's team, the St. John Jacks Atlantics, were representing Eastern Canada. It was a sellout and very exciting for an 8-year-old boy. His father owned the team. I thought that was pretty cool. And there's one last stop, which I've added based on some information that came in from the Gus family. And this is the site where 251 King Street is now, and this would have been the location of the Basson family home. I suspect neither of the buildings that you see from this Google Maps image are those buildings. And you may understand why when I read some of the description. And some of the information I have came from Jonathan Gus and also from Karen Gus Oberfield. So the Basson family included Davis and Carrie Basson and their 4 children, Frank and Edward, Millie Gus, who we talked about last week on Orange Street, and Florence, or Numi, as she was known. And I'm just going to read from the notes that I've gotten from Jonathan Gus that I've edited a little bit. And he wrote, our maternal grandfather, Davy Basson, and our grandmother, Carrie Sandler Basson from Haverhill, Massachusetts, and their 4 kids, Edward, Florence, also known as Numi, Frank, and Mildred, lived in a house at the east end of King Street East on the north side, just before the water. Davy was born in Poland and without moving, grew up in Lithuania because the border moved. He left Lithuania at age 18, went to England where he became a tailor and joined the Tailors Union. And when he came to St. John in the 1890s, was an itinerant tailor and clothing salesman. After years on the road, he set up shop in St. George and later moved the family back to St. John, where he founded Basson's Haberdashery on King Street at the corner with Germain Street. The store was famous for its want ads. 25 pairs of overalls, looking for 25 workmen. When he retired, he turned the store over to his cousin, Carl J. Basson, and his son, Mickey. Their oldest son, Edward, born in 1900, attended McGill University, went on to be an eminent ophthalmologist in New York City. Dr. Frank Basson, also a McGill grad, became a hematologist at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City. And I added some notes here because I did a quick little search and discovered that according to Wikipedia, Frank Basson was working with Abraham Cornswig when they discovered what was called Basson-Cornswig disease, a rare autoimmune recessive disorder that appears in infancy and affects mostly males of Ashkenazi descent and affects the ability of the body to absorb proteins in the diet. So did not expect to find something on Wikipedia related to somebody who lived in St. John. So that was kind of interesting. Florence, or Numi, married Mickey Siegel, who was the owner of a factory in Massachusetts that produced high heels for women's shoes. And Millie married Ben Gus, stayed in St. John, and raised the four of us. So Jonathan, Karen, Faith, and Judy, who were all mentioned last week on the Orange Street tour. And then Jonathan goes on to add, each of the Basson siblings came back to Pamdenack every summer with their families and were a valued part of that community. When Davy and Carrie bought land in Pamdenack, they couldn't afford a waterfront property. So he purchased 11 acres of forest well back from the water. He planted an apple orchard and a blueberry field. And we had a forest that ran down to the brook that divides Pamdenack from Grand Bay, with the Weasels and Sam Davises on the Grand Bay side, and the Bassons and Gusses on the Pamdenack side. As for the house on King Street East, one of his children commented on Grandpa's weaknesses as an investor, citing the fact that the house on King Street East was so badly built that the wind blew through it. Uncle Eddie said to Jonathan that the walls were so thin that as a teenager he couldn't sleep, couldn't block out the sounds of Carrie and Davy discussing the news of the day. So he would just get up again and go to the pool hall to shoot pool. If you knew him as an ophthalmologist, you would not have guessed. My dad, Ben Gus, told me about the ads. He worked part-time for Grandpa to earn money for college, and he loved the want ads. Maybe he wrote them. And then he later married the boss's daughter. So I would like to thank you for coming on this virtual walk along King Street East. And I just have a couple of more slides to show you, and then I'm going to stop sharing my screen and you can unmute to share your comments, suggestions, memories, corrections. I noticed a couple of typos, so I'll catch those later. And so that if we do this again, I will have even more interesting stuff to share. So this is, for those of you who are new to this is part of a series. So last week we had Orange Street. Next week you could come back at the same time and we'll talk about Leinster Street. And then on March the 1st, Elliott Row. We'll take a 1-week break and then come back for 3 walks through the Sharazedic Cemetery, looking at the graves of Jewish war veterans, the Jewish merchants of Main Street, and those who died early from murder, illness, or accident. And then after a break for Passover, we'll come back for 1 more street and we'll walk along Summer Street. And I'm just going to put in my shameless plug for this summer's exhibit, Coming of Age, Bar Mitzvah, and Bat Mitzvah celebrations. And it'd be really great if you could share your memories, invitations, photographs, kippas, and other memorabilia for our exhibit, whether it's from your Bar Mitzvah or Bat Mitzvah or somebody else's. All of those stories will really help to make the exhibit something that people want to see.